For more than half a century, Carol Burnett has been remembered as Hollywood's embodiment of gentleness. A woman who never raised her voice, never lashed out, never met cruelty with anything other than grace. With her warm smile, her familiar little wave, and a voice that always carried kindness. She made millions believe she was someone who never felt anger and never carried a single hidden wound. But reality has never been as soft as the image she projected. At 90, after a lifetime of swallowing the hurt she believed she had to endure in silence for the sake of others' peace, Carol Burnett has finally admitted that there were men who wounded her in ways she could never forget. Colleagues, friends, even an ex-husband. Hollywood legends adored by the public, and the behind-the-scenes power figures who ruled television from the shadows. Men whose hands touched her life not to lift her up, but to push her toward moments of humiliation, heartbreak, and shaken faith. And what shocked the public most was not who they were, but how Carol Burnett told it. Slowly, calmly, without resentment, yet with a clarity that chilled, like someone who had carried those pains for an entire lifetime, waiting until her heart was tough enough to look back without trembling. This story contains betrayal, exhausting backstage clashes, cutting remarks delivered in front of hundreds that left her deeply hurt, explosive arguments between collaborators who once saw each other as family, and private wounds untouched by any spotlight. This is not the tale of a comedian. It is the story of a woman who spent her life making others laugh, yet had to learn how to bear her own pain in silence. Today, we listen to Carol Burnett herself speak about the men she couldn't stand and the moments that carved into her heart the truth that kindness may save others. But it is not an invincible shield. Only when her wounds had healed halfway did Carol dare open the rest for the world to see. And that is when her life appears in its truest form. Beautiful, strong, and at times so cruel it leaves you breathless. In the 1970s, America had a habit very different from today. Every Saturday night, families turned off the stove, tidied the living room, gathered around the TV, and waited for the familiar opening music of the Carol Burnett Show. It wasn't just entertainment, it was a national ritual. Carol Burnett became America's woman, and Studio 33, their filming home, was considered the cathedral of laughter. Everyone shone, from Carol to Harvey Korman, Tim Conway, and Vicki Lawrence. But behind those endless waves of applause was a pressure almost no one could imagine. CBS saw Carol as their golden goose and forced the team to run at a brutal pace. One new episode every week, no mistakes allowed, no dip in humor, no disappointing America's expectations. Carol had to hold the show together, hold the morale of her cast, hold the ratings, hold the creativity, hold the smile on her face even when she barely had the breath to keep going. And in that atmosphere, stretched tight like a wire, the underground storms began to form. Harvey Korman, the most beloved man on the show after Carol, started to change. He had always been temperamental, but the pressure made his mood swing sharper. One day, he joked like a child. The next, he threw a script on the floor over a tiny issue with the lighting or camera angle. Tim Conway, improvising wildly, sometimes threw Harvey off balance during scenes. Carol saw it every day. The louder the laughter on stage, the heavier the exhaustion behind it. Then came CBS, locked in a ratings battle with NBC, pushing for a younger show. They wanted less Carol, more male guest stars, fewer heartfelt segments, the parts Carol considered the soul of the program. Just a little less Carol, one CBS executive once said. Audiences want something edgier now. The words were a blade. Carol understood. They didn't just want to change the show. They wanted to change her. None of this exploded all at once. It smoldered day by day, week by week, season by season. Each time, Carol stepped onto the stage in a dazzling Bob Mackie gown, smiling wide. No one knew that just minutes earlier she'd been in a meeting fighting with an executive who wanted to cut a segment she loved. No one knew that backstage. Harvey sat in silence, refusing to look at anyone. Vicki Lawrence carefully avoided the tension, and Tim Conway tried to crack jokes just to keep the mood from collapsing. To viewers, this was the golden era. To Carol, it was also the time when she felt like she was standing on the razor's edge between perfection and collapse. Pressure, disrespect from the network, sudden outbursts from colleagues, and the responsibility to make everything appear flawless. All of it fused into one enormous storm with her alone in the eye. And that storm would finally explode one April afternoon, right when the world still believed they were the happiest family on television. That afternoon, a single offhand remark from Harvey Korman would make Carol Burnett rise to her feet. And in that moment, her kindness would turn to steel for the very first time. That afternoon would go down as legend in American television history. And it was only the beginning. In the eyes of the audience, Harvey Korman and Carol Burnett were the definition of chemistry. One glance between them was enough to know what to say, what to do, and when a single smile would make the entire studio erupt. Viewers believed they were artistic soulmates, a kind of connection modern TV rarely manages to recreate. But what the audience saw on stage was only half the story. The other half, the one Carol kept to herself, was a silent tragedy. Harvey was always a brilliant actor, but also the quickest to anger in the entire cast. In the early seasons, his unpredictability was little more than passing summer showers. But by the 7th year, as the show reached its peak and the pressure weighed on every performance, those showers turned into storms. He would arrive on set heavy-hearted, sometimes silent for an entire morning, sometimes shouting at an assistant over a single piece of tape placed slightly wrong. Even Tim Conway, the one who used his goofiness to melt any tension, could no longer stop those bursts of rage. Carol understood Harvey. She knew he was sensitive, proud, and easily wounded by things others barely noticed. But the more she understood, the more exhausting it became. A show needed stability, yet Harvey's mood made each taping feel like walking a tightrope. The lighting crew feared being shouted at. The costume team adjusted every detail in terror of triggering him. And Carol had to stand in the middle of it all, trying to keep the peace, even as she fought her own battles with CBS. Then came the day that changed everything. One April afternoon in 1974, Studio 33 lit up for a rehearsal with guest star Petula Clark, who had just flown in from London. The team was running through a simple segment, but a small lighting mistake left half of Harvey's face in shadow, and he exploded like a powder keg. "All these years and you still can't get a single light right?" He threw his script onto the floor. The entire studio froze. Dave Powers, the show's director, stepped in to calm him, but Harvey kept roaring, each word louder than the last. Then he said the sentence that stopped time. "Even Carol doesn't care." That moment, just one simple line, cut Carol deeper than any argument they had ever had. She had spent her entire life working with absolute respect for everyone around her. And now, the friend who once made her laugh until she cried treated that kindness as something cheap and disposable. Carol stood up, not angry, not trembling. She walked down from the bleachers and approached Harvey, small in stature but with eyes hardened like steel. "Harvey," she said slowly, each word measured with discipline. "I've had enough. "If you cannot respect everyone here, you don't need to be here." That was all. No yelling, no humiliation, no dramatics. Just a calmness so sharp that the entire studio fell silent. Someone later said, "You could hear a microphone hit the floor." Harvey stood there, face drained of color. He said nothing. No apology, no protest. He simply turned and walked straight out the door. And what broke people's hearts even more was this: no one followed him. When the door closed, Carol remained standing where she was. Then she returned to her seat, placed her hands on her lap, and stared at Harvey's chair, now empty. She sat like that for more than 30 minutes. No one dared approach. A lighting technician later said, "I've never seen Carol Burnett that sad, not because Harvey walked out, but because she knew their friendship was gone." The news of Harvey leaving the show exploded like a bomb. The Los Angeles Herald-Examiner ran the headline, "Harvey Korman walks out of the Carol Burnett Show during rehearsal." Hollywood shook. Everyone asked, what happened between the two closest partners in TV history? Carol said nothing. She kept filming, kept smiling, kept making everything perfect as if nothing had ever happened, but her silence only made the rumors grow louder. People said Carol was jealous, said Harvey had become arrogant, said CBS wanted to replace him, said the cracks in the show had been there for years. 3 days later, while the team was in a meeting, the office phone rang. Harvey was on the line, his voice trembling. "I need to talk to Carol." When she picked up, he simply said, "I was wrong. I want to come back." The next day, Harvey returned to Studio 33. He walked into the conference room, bowed his head, apologized to everyone, then turned to Carol. "I forgot why I started. I'm sorry." Carol gave him a small smile, stepped forward, and hugged him. The whole team clapped. But everyone understood. Once glass cracks, even if you glue it back together, the fracture remains forever. Harvey stayed until 1977, but their friendship never returned to what it once was. And for Carol, who had always treated kindness like a suit of armor, this was the first time she truly understood. Sometimes the people you trust the most are the ones who can wound you the deepest. And the storm with Harvey was only the first. Much greater hurts were waiting for her, at home, in her marriage, and in the very people who once promised to protect her. If Harvey Korman was the greatest professional pain of Carol's life, then Joe Hamilton was the deepest personal one. The wound carved right into the center of a heart she had spent her whole life trying to shield from the spotlight. He was the man Carol once trusted completely, loved with a sincerity so pure she believed she had finally found her soulmate. But he was also the one who, with the coldness of power and ego, made Carol realize that sometimes the cruelest betrayal doesn't come from an enemy, but from the person who has stood closest to you the longest. Joe entered Carol's life in the early 1960s as a calm, seasoned, magnetic man. He was 10 years older, had weathered career storms, and had a way of reading even the things Carol didn't dare to say out loud. At a time when Carol was taking her first steps into the vast world of television, Joe was the one who steadied her, kept her grounded, and gave her the sense of safety her fractured childhood had never provided. When they married, everyone believed they were CBS's power couple, meant to be. And for many years, that was true. But power has a dark side. As the Carol Burnett Show became a national phenomenon, Joe Hamilton slowly shifted from protector to controller. He wanted to approve scripts before Carol even saw them, wanted to choose the guests, wanted to cut every emotional segment, the very parts Carol considered the soul of the show. He wanted a program filled with nothing but jokes, while Carol believed the audience needed more. And from that clash in creative philosophy, a small gap opened between them. At first, just a hairline crack, but over time, it stretched into a fault line neither dared to confront. Joe began spending less time at home. Carol assumed it was work. But Hollywood never lets secrets live long. An assistant saw Joe having dinner with a young editor. A cast member hinted at something in the CBS hallway. A lighting tech whispered that Joe and the girl sat far too close at Showhouse Restaurant. Carol knew. She knew all of it, but she didn't ask. She tried to hold the image of a family together for her 3 daughters, tried to believe love was strong enough to mend any misunderstanding. Until 1982, when the truth hit her in the face. While reviewing contracts for a new project, Carol's lawyer discovered that Joe had formed his own company, Hamilton Productions, and had registered copyrights for spin-offs based on sketches Carol herself had created, especially Mama's Family. Carol's name appeared nowhere. The creator of the characters, the soul behind those stories, was erased from her own work. Carol didn't explode. She only felt a coldness climb up her spine, as if someone had extinguished the stage lights inside her. When she confronted Joe in his CBS office, his answer told her everything was over. "This is business, Carol, not feelings." One sentence, enough to erase 20 years of marriage. On March 3, 1983, Carol filed for divorce. Hollywood erupted. People talked about their breakup even more than the art they had created together. The battle over assets lasted nearly a year. Joe demanded control of the entire program catalog, demanded the majority of syndication profits, even demanded the rights to the show's name. Carol didn't fight for money. She only wanted to hold on to the one thing still intact: her professional dignity. In June 1984, the court ruled that Carol would retain the rights to the name The Carol Burnett Show. Joe would receive 40% of syndication profits. The press called it Carol's most graceful victory. But only she knew. There was no victory at all. Only a broken marriage that 2 people had once tried to build with everything they had. After the divorce, Carol cut all contact. Joe attempted to create several new shows, but none found success the way they had when he stood beside Carol. When he died of heart disease in 1991, Carol did not attend the funeral. She sent only a bouquet of white flowers, accompanied by a brief note. "I wish you peace, Joe." A farewell as soft as a breeze, yet beneath it lay a lifetime of hurt. And when the door on that marriage finally closed, Carol understood that professional pain can't destroy you. But pain inside the family can change you forever. What she didn't yet know was that more wounds, public clashes fought under the full gaze of Hollywood, were waiting ahead. And those blows would cut even deeper than betrayal. If Joe Hamilton left a wound in Carol's heart, then Cary Grant and Lorne Michaels left wounds in the very center of her professional dignity, wounds that drew no blood, yet stung so sharply that an entire lifetime on stage could not erase them. Because some blows don't come from power or betrayal, but from contempt. The one thing Carol never imagined she would face after reaching the pinnacle of American television. Cary Grant was the kind of man Hollywood worshipped: elegant, flawless, icy, and always impeccably composed. Carol Burnett was the opposite: warm, imperfect, full of humor, and beloved because of the humanity she brought to the stage. Those 2 worlds could exist side by side, but never at the same point. In 1968, at an awards event at the Beverly Hilton, Carol, then already America's comedy queen, approached Cary Grant with genuine admiration. She had just come off a triumphant year of the Carol Burnett Show, wearing a radiant red Bob Mackie gown like a symbol of the joy she brought to the nation. But one sentence transformed that shining moment into a cold memory she would never forget. When a director jokingly said, "Cary, have you watched Carol's show? The whole country does." Cary Grant gave a small, polite smile, then released a line sharp enough to freeze the room. "Oh, that show where she waves her arms, makes faces, and overacts? I don't understand why people enjoy that sort of thing." No insults screamed. No direct attack. Just refined disdain. The sharpest weapon old Hollywood elites used to cut someone down without staining their own image. Carol stood there, serene as an unruffled lake, while inside her chest thousands of needles landed at once. Then she replied, in a voice light as air but heavy as stone. Perhaps people prefer laughing with real human beings, rather than laughing with perfection. The room fell silent, and Carol walked away, leaving Cary standing in the glow he always believed was untouchable. 2 days later, the press called it the iciest confrontation of the decade. Cary Grant never apologized. Carol never mentioned it again. But that night taught her something. In Hollywood, comedy could make millions laugh, yet it could never protect her from the contempt of a few perched on ivory towers. But if Cary Grant wounded her with open disdain, Lorne Michaels hurt her with something far more baffling, a silence that lasted nearly half a century. A silence that made all of Hollywood ask the same question. Why has Carol Burnett never been invited to host Saturday Night Live? Carol paved the way for women in American TV comedy. That much is undeniable. SNL became the gold standard of modern comedy. Naturally, the two worlds should have collided in the 1970s. But Lorne Michaels refused, more than once, with no proper explanation, no convincing reasoning. In an internal meeting documented in Live from New York, an editor recalled Lorne once saying, "She's the face of old television. Our show doesn't need that." Those who worked with Carol said she wasn't angry, just saddened. She once told Larry King, half joking, half truth, "Maybe I'm not edgy enough for them." But every time SNL invited other comedy legends, Betty White, Lily Tomlin, Candice Bergen, Carol was passed over again. Decades rolled by, rumors, debates, analytical articles, and then when NBC produced 90 Years of Laughter and Love in 2023, the question resurfaced. Why has Carol Burnett, who shaped an entire generation of television comedy, never been invited even once? Carol smiled and answered with a breeze-like calm. "Maybe they don't need me, but I don't need them either." A small sentence, but it ignited the hashtag #InviteCarol2SNL, spreading to over 40 million views. The world took her side. Carol didn't need SNL to validate her worth, yet that 50-year silence taught her something about Hollywood. Sometimes prejudice is a fortress, and the woman who wants to cross it must be stronger than all the coldness thrown her way. And while work had given her wounds that throbbed quietly, modern pop culture delivered another blow. A wound of mockery when Carol's dignity was turned into a cheap joke on a beloved animated show watched across America. But that is the story of the next chapter, when a 73-year-old woman decided to stand up against the entire Fox empire for a joke that dragged her image through the mud. If Cary Grant wounded her with refined contempt, if Lorne Michaels hurt her with an icy, inexplicable silence, then Johnny Carson, the king of late-night America, left Carol Burnett with a scar that would never heal. With Grant, she could respond with wit. With Michaels, she could turn away. But with Johnny Carson, there was no comeback strong enough, no way to walk away without leaving regret behind. Because with Carson, the betrayal didn't come from a stranger, but from someone she once considered a friend. In the 1960s and 1970s, when The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson ruled American television, Carol Burnett was one of its most beloved guests. Audiences waited for their exchanges. Carson sharp and smirking, Carol warm and quick. He was the king of irony, she the queen of heartfelt comedy. Few knew that off camera they shared late-night conversations, career advice, and a rare trust in a Hollywood built on calculation and survival. Carson once told friends, "Carol is one of the few people I truly respect, but respect does not last forever." When the Carol Burnett Show reached its peak, drawing millions each week and sweeping Emmys, Carson began hearing the question he despised most. Is Carol the newer, softer, more beloved version of Johnny Carson? Johnny Carson, who held absolute power in late-night TV, did not enjoy sharing the spotlight, and Carol's rising stardom pushed her unknowingly into his forbidden territory, unspoken competition. The first crack came from something small but unmistakable. Carson stopped laughing during Carol's stories. Before, he had been the loudest laugher in the room. Now he merely smiled faintly, propping his chin on his hand, analyzing instead of enjoying. The studio crew noticed instantly. The air had shifted. Then Carson's team began reducing Carol's appearances on the show, even as audience demand soared. A former Tonight Show producer later said, "Carson didn't hate Carol. He hated the feeling of no longer being the center." But the real blow came in 1979. Carol was preparing to end her show after more than a decade of triumph. She hoped to appear one last time on The Tonight Show as a graceful farewell to late-night viewers. A fitting, beautiful goodbye. Carson rejected her. No explanation, no letter, no phone call. Just a cold message delivered through an assistant. "We don't have room for her this week." Carol could not believe it until NBC confirmed it. To her, it wasn't a professional rejection. It was the denial of a friendship, a message that she had stepped into a realm Carson allowed no one to enter, the space where he was the sole star. And the most painful part? Johnny Carson never explained, never called, never apologized. Carol stayed silent. She didn't go to the press, she didn't retaliate. But in a 1990 interview, when asked about Carson, she said only 4 gentle but bitter words. "Some wounds stay closed." Years after Carson died, someone asked if she regretted anything. Carol answered in a steady voice without the slightest tremble, "I wish it had ended differently." But Johnny chose silence, and that silence said enough. In Hollywood, coldness can cut deeper than any insult. Johnny Carson didn't attack her, didn't mock her, didn't confront her. He simply let go. And that act of letting go, quiet, final, merciless, became the deepest wound Carol Burnett ever carried. Among the long list of men who hurt Carol Burnett, there was only one woman who appeared as a light, an anchor of humanity. Lucille Ball, the comedy icon who understood earlier than anyone that success does not shield you from loneliness, from fractures, from sleepless nights spent grieving love, marriage, and invisible wounds. If Harvey Korman, Cary Grant, Marlon Brando, or Johnny Carson left Carol with scars that refused to heal, Lucille Ball gave her the opposite, a truth sharper than any insult. That no matter how strong you are, women in comedy must learn to save themselves in silence. They met in the late 1960s, when the Carol Burnett Show was rising and Lucille Ball was already the immortal Lucy of American television. Carol once said, "She was the first person who told me that women in comedy always pay a price. Not with flowery advice, but with the cracks of Lucy's own life." Lucille Ball had survived a shattered marriage with Desi Arnaz, brilliant, foundational, but also a serial cheater whose success pushed them further apart. Carol looked at Lucy and saw herself reflected back, a woman trying to hold on to her identity, her heart, her family. and still losing to the brutal gravity of show business and betrayal. In 1974, when Carol faced her crisis with Harvey Korman, the angry outburst on stage, the unbearable decision to fire a friend, it was Lucille Ball who called first. No judgment, no, "You should do this," just one sentence that stayed carved in Carol's heart forever. "You have to be stronger than the men around you. They can't stand it when a woman is loved more than they are." That wasn't advice. It was the confession of a woman whose own husband had dimmed her light. 3 years later, when Carol's marriage to Joe Hamilton collapsed in a storm of public scrutiny and bitter asset division, Lucy embraced her backstage at CBS and whispered, "Don't let them think you've been broken. When a woman in comedy falls, all of Hollywood laughs. But when you stand up, they go silent." Hollywood did go silent, because no one understood better than Lucille Ball that female comedians were not allowed to be fragile, even though their hearts were softer than anyone's. But what made Lucy unforgettable wasn't just her wisdom. It was the tragedy of her final years, a tragedy that became a warning Carol carried for life. In her later years, Lucille Ball confided in Carol her greatest fear, not failure, not aging, but being forgotten while still alive. Carol Burnett, who always shone on stage, saw for the first time in Lucy's eyes a haunting loneliness, the loneliness of a legend left behind by time. When Lucille Ball died in 1989, Carol stood in the church, staring at Lucy's photograph with darkened eyes, and understood that stage lights were never shelter. They were only a beautiful curtain covering the wounds women carry forever. A few months later, in an interview, Carol said something that made America fall silent. "Lucy wasn't someone who hurt me. She was the one who taught me that it's men who can hurt women like us the most." In that single sentence lived the bitterness of Cary Grant, the violation of Marlon Brando, the silence of Johnny Carson, and the betrayal of Joe Hamilton. But the lessons Lucy left Carol ran deeper than all those wounds, because they were delivered through love, understanding, and Lucy's own pain. Lucille Ball was not the person Carol resented most. She was the one Carol missed most. If the conflicts with Harvey Korman or Cary Grant happened behind the curtain, then the confrontation with Seth MacFarlane became the most public wound of Carol Burnett's life, a clash between two generations of comedy, between respect and mockery, between human-centered tradition and modern shock humor. In 2005, when Family Guy aired an episode mocking Carol Burnett, no one expected that a few seconds of crude humor from Seth MacFarlane would pierce a wound Carol had been hiding for nearly half a century. The image of the charwoman, the iconic character Carol had created in her early days, the gentle cleaning woman representing America's working class, was turned into a vulgar joke in animation. Carol watched the clip in silence, her eyes suddenly darkening. To someone else, it might have been just parody. To Carol, it was an attack on a child of her heart, something she had protected her entire life. Family members said she rarely became angry. But that afternoon, she stood up, set her notebook on the table, and said one sentence that made everyone around her realize she would not back down. "This isn't about comedy anymore. This is about dignity." In 2007, Carol Burnett officially sued Seth MacFarlane and Fox for $6 million, not to make money, as tabloids twisted it, but to send a message. There are lines comedy should not cross, and there are cultural symbols that must not be trampled. The lawsuit immediately became national news. On one side stood a humane comedy legend, the face of classic television. On the other, a mischievous modern genius whose satire had no boundaries. The media called it a cultural war between two eras. Carol didn't want revenge. She only wanted an apology. But MacFarlane refused. At one event, He even hinted that Carol didn't understand the new generation. The worst part wasn't the joke on screen. It was the arrogance behind it. Carol appeared in court calm, wearing a cream coat, hair neatly brushed, her eyes sharp, but not sad. She told the court, "I don't object to parody. I object to disrespect. I'm not suing to win. I'm suing to say that women, working people, and the characters who represent them deserve respect." The court ruled that Family Guy had not broken the law. Legally, Carol lost. But in the eyes of the public, she won completely. Support poured in. Newspapers called her the last guardian of classic comedy. And more importantly, Americans, for the first time in years, rallied to defend a value they thought had disappeared: kindness in comedy. What few knew, because Carol never said it publicly, was that after the trial, Lucy Arnaz, Lucille Ball's daughter, sent Carol a handwritten note. "My mother would have stood with you." Carol kept that letter in her drawer for many years. And Seth MacFarlane? Years later, in a rare interview, he quietly admitted, "Carol Burnett is someone we should have respected more. We went too far." But for Carol, the apology came too late. She didn't hold a grudge. She never brought it up again. She simply chose silence. The kind of silence Lucille Ball once called the dignity of strong women. The battle with Family Guy was never just a lawsuit. It was a declaration that no matter how times change, laughter must still have a heart. And no one understood that better than Carol Burnett, a woman who spent her entire life proving that kindness can be a weapon, too. Among the names that hurt Carol Burnett, there is one that surprises many: Marlon Brando. Hollywood called him a genius, the most mysterious man ever to grace the screen. But to Carol, he was a memory she wished she could bury. One summer night in 1972, when a single phone call plunged her entire week into anxiety and anger. It was July, right after The Godfather had turned Brando into a legend all over again. Los Angeles at night was so quiet, the hills of Coldwater Canyon felt like they were sleeping. Carol Burnett had just put her two daughters to bed when the phone rang at 3 a.m. The housekeeper thought it was an emergency from CBS and woke her. The voice on the other end was low, slow, and full of confidence. "Carol, this is Marlon Brando." At first, she thought someone was joking, until Brando recalled in perfect detail a sketch from the Carol Burnett Show he had just watched in a CBS rerun. He praised her precision in using silence to create laughter, something even many comedians never mastered. The first minutes were strange but still polite. Carol, always gracious, didn't want to appear rude. But the longer they talked, the slower his voice became, softer, dreamier, and drifting into the tone of a man who no longer recognized the line between familiarity and intrusion. Carol later said the moment she began to withdraw was when Brando lowered his voice and said, "Television needs more women like you. Real women." It wasn't the words, it was the way he said them. Drawn out, ambiguous, and crossing boundaries. Carol understood immediately. She stayed calm and cut in gently but firmly. "Mr. Brando, thank you, but I have to get up early tomorrow. I'll let you go now." She hung up. She thought that was the end. But Hollywood never let secrets sleep. Only hours later, The Hollywood Reporter ran the headline: "Brando calls Carol Burnett at 3 a.m. The Godfather star's strange late-night conversation." Rona Barrett and Luella Parsons, the two most powerful gossip columnists in America, fanned the flames, framing it as a midnight flirtation. Other papers claimed Brando had called several more times, and Carol refused to answer. What hurt Carol wasn't the scandal. It was the feeling of being violated. She feared the public, especially women, would misunderstand. feared people would attach to her a strange friendship she had never invited. And most of all, she hated that her boundaries were crossed by someone she had quietly admired from afar. Vicki Lawrence later said Carol couldn't smile even backstage that entire week. At the studio, Carol uttered one short, sharp sentence that revealed the true wound. "He didn't understand what's appropriate, and I cannot let myself be put in that position again." After that night, an unwritten rule appeared in Carol's schedule. No phone calls after midnight. Not even from CBS. CBS knew why, but never asked. What even fewer people knew, Carol actively avoided Brando for years. At the 1974 AFI Awards, when Brando unexpectedly appeared, she immediately changed direction. At every major event, her assistants checked guest lists to ensure they would never appear in the same frame. This detail only surfaced years later in Hollywood Inside Out. And Brando? When asked about the incident, he simply shrugged. Carol takes things too seriously. It was just a conversation, a sentence as light as air. But to Carol, it was pure arrogance, and the reason she never wanted to forgive him. The most important part is this: the Brando incident didn't make Carol angry. It changed her. She became more cautious, more guarded, and realized that even a woman as famous as she was could be placed in a vulnerable position in a male-dominated Hollywood. Years later, when recalling it, Carol never spoke with bitterness. She spoke with clarity. One sentence, sharp as a blade. Not every genius knows how to respect other people. Of all the wounds Carol Burnett carried in her lifetime, none cut deeper than the one named Cary Hamilton. The conflicts with Harvey Korman, Joe Hamilton's betrayal, Cary Grant's condescension, Lorne Michaels' coldness, those were scratches compared to the pain of losing a child. Cary never betrayed her. On the contrary, she was the person Carol loved most, the one she believed she had saved from darkness, until darkness returned one final time and took her away forever. Cary was born at the very moment Carol was climbing to the height of fame, a child raised behind television stages, surrounded by rehearsals, studio laughter, and nights when her mother came home too late to read bedtime stories. Carol tried desperately to keep her family separate from the spotlight, but Los Angeles was still Hollywood, and Hollywood never truly leaves any child alone. From early on, Cary felt she was living inside a shadow too big for her. She once asked an assistant, "When will people see me as me, not just as Carol's daughter?" That sensitivity, combined with an artist's soul, made Cary more vulnerable than anyone realized. And everything began to collapse when she turned 15. Carol opened her daughter's door one night and found her shaking, hiding something behind her back. In that moment, Carol didn't yell. She didn't scold. She said one sentence Cary remembered forever. "You can tell me anything, as long as you don't lie." But youth rarely has the courage to be honest. Cary slipped deeper into addiction, and Carol began living years of contradiction, making the whole nation laugh by day, then crying in the bathroom alone every night. At 17, Cary's situation became unmanageable. Carol, who had always avoided using her fame as a weapon, was forced to do what she never wanted: use every bit of influence, every dollar she had, to put Cary into rehab. She knew Hollywood would gossip, knew tabloids like National Enquirer would feast on it. But she did it anyway, because this time she wasn't Carol Burnett, the television icon. She was a mother trying to pull her child back from the edge. In the years that followed, Cary recovered. And miraculously, she didn't just recover. She bloomed. She acted in fame, wrote plays, composed music, and told stories her mother had never dared to speak aloud. When Carol was writing Hollywood Arms based on her own heartbreaking childhood, It was Cary who revised every scene, added every line of dialogue, stitching together the broken fragments of her mother's youth with a heart that had once been saved. Carol said in an interview, "She helped me tell the story. I never had the courage to write." But life never gives back anything without asking for another price. In 2002, Cary was suddenly diagnosed with lung cancer that had spread to her brain. Carol, who had fought 20 years to keep her daughter alive, now had to sit beside her hospital bed, hold the same small hand she once held when Cary was little, and accept that this battle could not be won. No television show, no Emmy, no power in the industry could save Cary a second time. On the final night, Cary turned to her mother and whispered, "Mommy, I love you." Carol asked, "Are you scared?" And Cary smiled faintly. "No, because you're here." Those were the last words Carol ever heard from her daughter. When Cary closed her eyes, a part of Carol died with her. No scandal, no man, no public insult had ever cut her as deeply as that loss. After the funeral, Carol refused to let anyone else deliver the eulogy. She stood up herself, writing it, reading it, her voice trembling but never breaking, as if trying to prove that her love was strong enough to keep her standing, even with a shattered heart. And then, as she had always done throughout her career, Carol took that pain and turned it into something good. She founded the Carrie Hamilton Fund, supporting addiction recovery programs, helping cancer patients, and protecting young people who were just like her daughter once was. Carol once said backstage, "I couldn't save Cary a second time, but I can save someone else." And she did, fulfilling a promise to the daughter who had saved her in the darkest years of her life. At 90, when most of her contemporaries have long left the stage, Carol Burnett still moves with a gentleness that time cannot erode. But after all the laughter, the pain, the betrayals, and the losses, what surprises people most is not her endurance, but her serenity in looking back at her life. A serenity born from someone who has stood in the middle of storms and survived long enough to tell the story. Carol does not write exposés. She doesn't seek revenge. She doesn't go to the press to complain. She simply chooses to speak the truth only when she's old enough to know that the truth, too, deserves to be freed. In a conversation with Rolling Stone, when asked about the people who had hurt her the most, she neither dodged nor exaggerated. She simply smiled. "I've forgiven them. But forgiveness doesn't mean I forget." That applied to Harvey Korman, the partner who once made her cry backstage and also made her laugh more than anyone else. It applied to Joe Hamilton, the husband who lifted her to the top and also taught her that even in marriage, love sometimes loses to greed. It applied to Cary Grant, Lorne Michaels, Marlon Brando, men of an old Hollywood where ego too easily overshadowed respect. Carol never denied the pain they caused. She simply refused to let them define her. But the thing that changed her the most came from elsewhere: the loss of Cary. It made Carol softer, yet strangely stronger. After Cary's death, Carol said she no longer feared anything. "I've survived the worst. When you lose a child, you can't be destroyed a second time." It was not a bitter line, just honest, quiet, as simple as the comedic roles she played all her life. In rare CBS backstage footage from the early 2000s, Carol still held on to an old ritual. Before stepping on stage, even if only for a few lines, she gently closed her eyes and whispered something under her breath. Vicki Lawrence later revealed, "Carol always said Cary's name before every performance, as if the girl were still backstage, waiting for her mom to finish one last number. And perhaps in some way, she still is." At 90, Carol no longer chases the spotlight. The spotlight chases her. She appears less often, more selectively, preserving an image untouched by time, as if she wants audiences to remember her by her smile, not by the fatigue of age. But in the rare moments she returns to television, especially during NBC's special Carol Burnett, 90 Years of Laughter plus Love, people saw an entirely new Carol, quieter, deeper, beautiful in the way someone becomes after living a life without regret. A reporter from The Hollywood Reporter once asked her, "Do you think you've been fully appreciated by this industry?" Carol just laughed softly. "I think I've been loved more than I ever expected. And the ones who didn't love me, they don't matter anymore." It was one of the few times she spoke of her wounds with a tone light as a breeze. Hollywood has changed. The people who once stood with her on stage, Harvey, Tim Conway, Joe Hamilton, Cary, are gone. The audiences who watched her in her prime are old now. But Carol remains, a thread connecting past and present, with eyes still warm as they were in her youth and a heart still steel strong when needed. On the night of her 90th celebration, after the lights dimmed and the crowd drifted away, people saw Carol staying behind, not waiting for anyone, not posing, just standing there, looking up at the red curtain, the thing that had fed her, hurt her, saved her, and in the end became the place where she learned to say thank you to life. Someone asked, "Is there anything you still want?" Carol smiled. "No, I've had a life full enough, beautiful enough, painful enough to be honest." Looking back at Carol Burnett's journey, what people admire most is not her 11 years at the top of American television, not the gleaming Emmys, nor the iconic sketches that made the nation laugh until it cried. The most beautiful thing in her life is the way she carried every wound. Backstage battles, public humiliations, sleepless nights after scandals, and the unimaginable pain of losing a child, and turned them into the gentle light audiences felt the moment she laughed. Behind the legend of Carol Burnett is not just a catalog of classic comedy, but a woman who lived so truthfully that by 90, life had nothing left to take from her. She understood that sometimes laughter is the final wall protecting a cracked heart. She understood that kindness is not weakness. It is a force powerful enough to make even Hollywood bow its head. She understood that forgiveness is not for forgetting, but for moving forward without letting old wounds bend your back. But above all, she understood that love, real love, is the only thing that outlives fame. Love for Cary, love for the stage, love for the audience, love for a life that gave her so much it sometimes felt unfair, and took so much it sometimes felt impossible to stand again. And perhaps that is why millions still watch old episodes of The Carol Burnett Show like a quiet ritual. They're not just watching a comedy show, they are finding a part of themselves in it. The part that knows how to laugh when everything is falling apart, how to stay gentle when life grows rough, how to rise after betrayal, and how to keep loving even after the heart has cracked. Today, as Carol steps into her 90s, she no longer chases the spotlight. The spotlight comes to her. And each time she appears, audiences applaud not only the legend that is Carol Burnett, they applaud the woman who lived a life so beautiful that every wound became light. If you've made it to the end of this story, leave a heart for Carol in the comments. As a small tribute to the woman who turned pain into laughter, loss into hope, and a thorn-filled life into something worth retelling forever. And if you want to continue journeying through emotional Hollywood stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to our channel.